श्रोते हो नमस्कार. संस्कृतीच्या पाऊलखुणा या कार्यक्रमात तुमचं स्वागत आणि निलिमा पटवर्धनचा नमस्कार. श्रोते हो, प्राचीन भारतीय संस्कृती आणि भाषाशास्त्रीय अध्ययन या विषयावर आंतरराष्ट्रीय कीर्तीचे भारतीय संस्कृतीचे अभ्यासक डॉक्टर कोएनराड एल्स्ट यांची इंद्रजित बागल यांनी घेतलेली मुलाखत आपण सध्या ऐकत आहोत. मागच्या आठवड्यात या मुलाखतीचा पूर्वार्ध आपण ऐकला. आज ऐकूया या मुलाखतीचा उत्तरार्ध. भारतीय संस्कृतीची प्राचीनता, सिंधू संस्कृती, याखेरीज संस्कृत भाषेची प्राचीनता अशा अनेक विषयांचा उहापोह डॉक्टर कोएनराड एल्स्ट यांनी या मुलाखतीत घेतला आहे. ऐकूया त्यांची इंद्रजित बागल यांनी इंग्रजीतून घेतलेली मुलाखत.
नमस्कार to all our listeners. Today we have with us Dr. Koenraad Elst. He is world-renowned scholar of Sinology, Indology and Philosophy. Dr. Elst, welcome to All India Radio, Pune. As of 2022, what archaeological and genetic evidences suggest about the possible origin of Aryas or the time of Aryas?
Yes, okay, now you have to see the limitations of these sciences. You see, what we are talking about is the homeland of a language family. We are not talking about the homeland of a people, because people can change language, and languages can change people. Like, for instance, Central Asia, like especially the Afghanistan area, is an enormous crossroads. Also in Europe, the Balkans is an enormous crossroads where constantly you see people are conquering, are fleeing, are migrating, and so on. And so it's very certain that in this context, people have changed language a few times. So, you know, you can't really link it to a physical type of people. So race is just not the issue. The same thing with material culture, the kind that is studied by archaeology. You see, people may speak one language and happen to have one pottery type, one type of burial customs, one type of housing, and so on. And then this material culture is taken over by another and some neighboring population with a different language. So they end up having the same material culture but speaking different languages. So you always have to be very careful if you use the archaeological or the genetic evidence. You know, what they say, what they show is, you know, the spread of material culture or the spread of a physical type. That's something else than the spread of a language. And you can see it very clearly in Indian history. You see, I don't believe in an Aryan invasion, but I do know that there have been a number of invasions. You see, the Scythians entered India, the Greeks, the Huns, the Kushanas, the Turks, and so on. They all entered India, and their genes are still present in the Indian population. Yes. Like I read some paper where it was said, you know, 17% of Indians show, you know, the presence of genes from Central Asia. Well, I don't know about the number, but at any rate, it is very certain that in the historical period, people have entered India and left their imprint on the Indian population. But none of them preserved its language. You see, there is no lobby of Greek speakers in India or of Turkic-speaking people. No, they all assimilated linguistically. Even when they had a strong ideology of separateness, like Islam is very, you know, militant about its own identity, and yet it didn't preserve its own language. There is no Persian lobby, no Arabic lobby in India. So what the Aryan invasion theory people are saying is that, okay, all these others entered India and lost their language, but somehow the Aryans were different. They entered India, they not only preserved their language, but they also imposed their language on the vast majority of the Indian population. So that's strange. At any rate, you see, the point I wanted to make is there is a difference between languages on the one hand and physical type or material culture on the other hand. Okay, you can, in terms of both archaeology and genetics, you can contrast the situation in India with the situation in Europe. In Europe, in about 3000 to 2500 BC, you see an enormous change. You see the physical population change. This is something that, 100 years ago we couldn't possibly know, but now, thanks to genetics, all this is being found out, that the population in Europe changed completely. So in some places 40%, in other places 95% of the original population disappeared and was replaced by invaders from the east. From this area in Ukraine, Russia, that has been designated by some people as the homeland. At any rate, from a European angle, it was the homeland. That's where the Indo-Europeans, the Aryans, came from. They also brought with them a completely different material culture. So you see a complete change in types of pottery, types of housing, types of burial, and so on. So you absolutely see there is a replacement of the native European population with a new incoming population from the east. This is what an Aryan invasion looks like. Now, it is also what you don't find in India.
So you want to suggest that the invaders in Europe was Indians?
Well, not exactly Indians. People who left India and then mixed with whatever population they found in Central Asia. So very mixed by the time they enter Europe. So there wasn't much Indian about them anymore, but yes, to some extent there still was.
So according to your study and research, how old is the Indian civilization?
Well, very old, you see. Homo sapiens, the human race is supposed to have entered India like 70,000 or so years ago. And so from then on, you can speak of Indian civilization, and that evolved gradually, but there's no revolution in there. There's no sudden appearance of new elements, so that's already Indian civilization. So it is that old. And then when you get the Harappan cities in like 3000 BC or so, that's a new development. That's a great advance, urbanization, but that is continuous with earlier stages that you can equally call Indian civilization. So Indian civilization is very old. Now, if you mean Vedic civilization, well, here we have to steer a middle course between two extremes. European scholars have said the Vedas date will now start only in about 1500 BC and then take a few centuries for developing, this whole corpus of hymns. And so that was based on a mere guess by Max Müller, Friedrich Max Müller,
Yes.
very influential 19th century Orientalist. But he was already criticized by his own pupils. You see, they said, well, this is not possible. First of all, it's arbitrary. You have no grounds to pinpoint that particular date. And anyway, it is very unreasonable. Because if you look at the ideological, the philosophical development between the earliest part of the Vedas and, let's say, the Buddha, there's so much in it that you can't cram it all together in less than 1,000 years. So the Vedas are definitely earlier. Some Western scholars also noted that there is a very little bit of astronomical evidence where certain stellar positions are mentioned in Vedic literature, and they give a vague idea of the time that the writing happened. And so they point to an era of about 2300 BC, This is when Kritika or the Pleiades were on the spring equinox, when Magha or Regulus was on the summer solstice. Anyway, I mean, I leave the technical details for now, but at any rate, you can pinpoint exactly when this happened. It's about 2300 BC. And these are not even the earlier books of the Rig Veda, which must have been centuries earlier. So it is not unreasonable to say that the Vedas start around 3000 BC, even a bit earlier. And so then they took their time, I mean, to be composed. You see, all these hymns were separate. There were a number of separate traditions, and then they were later combined, collected into the Rig Veda, then the Yajur Veda. But so, very definitely, the conventional date of 1500 BC that is still taught in all the history textbooks in Indian schools, that is definitely wrong. That is definitely too late. So you can easily 2500 BC at the least.
Whether the
Yeah.
Harappans or Indus civilization people and Aryas were same or different?
Yeah, that's also an important question. Well, they overlapped. Now, you see, the Harappan civilization is very large in geographical expanse. So it includes all the way from Kashmir, Punjab, Sindh, into Balochistan, and then eastwards to Gujarat, even into Maharashtra, with the heartland on the Saraswati River in what is now Haryana, and even western UP. And so it's very large, it's much larger than Mesopotamia, much more populous. And so, given that in those days people couldn't learn languages through internet courses or so, language communities cannot have been very large. So it's very unlikely that the entire Harappan civilization spoke one language. And indeed, the Vedas only speak about the area of Haryana, Punjab, western UP, a bit of Rajasthan, and not about Gujarat, not about Maharashtra, not about Sindh. So very probably these areas were foreign to them. Indeed, the word mlecha, a Sanskrit word meaning a foreigner, probably comes from the name Meluha, which is used in Sumerian texts in Mesopotamia about the traders from India. So they came from a country called Meluha, which is probably about the same area as Sindh, the southern province of Pakistan. So to the Vedic people, these were already foreigners. You know, they were part of what is now called India. Back then, the Vedic area was a lot smaller than that. And so for them, these people of whom we don't know the language, probably not Indo-European, were already foreigners. So the Vedic speech area was much smaller, and so it spread across India. It was Indian from the beginning, but not all of India. So it was a part of the Harappan civilization.
So, what is your personal view about how old the Sanskrit language could be?
Well, this is not a very controversial point, at least not in the linguists community. It is estimated that the fragmentation, the falling apart into different, not mutually understandable languages of the Indo-European family starts in about 3700 BC, give or take a few centuries, but not more than 7,000 years ago or 5,000 BC. So the stories about Sanskrit is 10,000 years old, 22,000 years old, as some recent theory says. You know, that I don't believe at all. So it's less than 6,000 years old, which is already quite respectable.
Is there any archaeological or other type of evidence of existence of Proto IndoEuropean language other than the just assumptions?
Well, the only material evidence that could prove it is if some writing could be found in this language that old. And well, the only thing we can do here, approximately, is to decipher the Indus script, the Harappan script. So that's not deciphered. And, you know, everything I've said so far is a bit provisional in the sense that the decipherment, when it finally gets done, could spring us a few surprises.
Here in India, some people, particularly the religious one, believe that the Sanskrit language is the most oldest language of the world, and it is the language of the nature. So isn't it possible that the other languages like the Latin or other European languages emerged some time ago from the Sanskrit?
Well, you see, this much you have to give, that Sanskrit is the oldest language in the world that is still relevant. You see, you have Egyptian and Sumerian writings from about 3,300 BC, 5,300 years ago, but those languages are not spoken anymore. And not even artificially. Similarly, in India, you have a movement for spoken Sanskrit that is already a lot more successful. But you see, even apart from spoken Sanskrit, the writings in Sanskrit are still relevant. You see, very many people study Sanskrit not to speak it, but at least to be in touch with this ancient literature. So, in a linguistic sense, Sanskrit is a dead language, which means it's a language that doesn't change anymore. That's a dead language. Definition of a dead language is not a language that has been discarded. No, it is a language that doesn't change anymore. And so Sanskrit is kept in the same form, Paninian Sanskrit, 2,500 years, exactly the same language. So in another sense, it is a living language in the sense that it is still kept relevant. And there are indeed lots of people who still write papers and theater plays and so on in Sanskrit, poetry in Sanskrit. So Sanskrit is quite alive. And so in that sense, yes, it is the oldest language in the world. And by old, I do not mean 1,000,000 years or so. I mean like 5,000 years.
Mahabharata, Ramayana, and other stories in Puranas are just mythological stories or have any historical accounts?
Yeah, well, the expression just mythological is is a bit of a prejudice. Long ago, you see, people used to believe stories quite literally. You know, like in Christianity in America, you have this creationist movement that believe the Bible stories literally. And so if the Bible says God created the world in 6 days, then they take that literally. That's how God created the world. So you have something similar in India, where a number of people do take the scriptures literally. You see, if Hanuman works some miracle, he flies through the air, then they take that literally. So that's one extreme, where you take things literally. It is, excuse me for the comparison, it is a little bit like children taking fairy tales literally. And the other extreme is that, no, we reject all this. You see, all these Mahabharatas on their children's stories, they were pure invention. Now, that's the other extreme, which I will now argue against. You see, the idea of pure fantasy is very modern. You know, you sit down and you're going to invent a story. And even that is not, you know, the stories you invent are not really totally invented, because you will all the time borrow elements from the reality around you. So even those invented stories are not 100% invention. But anyway, that's not what happened in the old days. You see, what happened was that a real event took place. Then this was related, this was narrated, this story was passed on. And then some literary-minded person took all those stories together and made some big epic out of it, which moreover wasn't entirely his, because There was no copyright in those days. So his son, his grandson, the friend of his grandson, and so on, other people, next generation, took that story and then added their own bits to it. So the story as we have it certainly is not historical in the sense that, a lot of embellishment has gone into it, even by people who didn't know what happened originally, but also by people who were there. They too already give an interpretation. It's like when a traffic accident happens and the police comes on the spot to interview all the people who saw it, they get 10 different stories. Related stories, similar stories, but still somewhat different, right? So that's about the best you can get if human beings, narrate a story. You see, in spite of all these reasons to say the epic as we have it is not a historical event, it is still based on a historical event. Let me make a comparison. In Greece and throughout educated Europe, you have these stories of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, we know this was written in about 700 BC. Now, we know that this is a story of a war, of the Greek siege of the city of Troy. And this really happened about 500 years earlier. About 1200 BC, such a war really happened. Now, we don't know very much about that war. And we know that the version of Homer is certainly not originally what happened, but it's related to it. Now, in the case of the Mahabharata, there is a very large historical core. We have the king lists. And of course, some people will say, oh, but the king lists are also mythological, they're also unhistorical. Well, no. You see, if we have a history of Egypt, and if we have a history of Mesopotamia, it is completely thanks to their king lists. We couldn't make a backbone of whatever archaeologists and so on find in these areas if we didn't have the king lists that the Egyptians, the Sumerians themselves made. So in India too, the Puranas have these impressive, very long king lists, and different versions of the king list differ a little bit, just like different accounts of a traffic accident also differ a little bit. That only adds to their historicity. You see, when people recall events, they recall them a bit differently. You can still see that they're talking about the same thing, but some details will differ and so on. Similarly, in the king lists, some mistakes have crept in, some names have been left out or mistakenly added or so, but broadly they are about the same thing. Now, a number of characters in the Mahabharata do appear in the king lists. Yudhishthira is there, Krishna is there, and so on. We have the names of Shantanu and Dhritarashtra and Vichitravirya in the Yajurveda, another source. So we have a number of different sources attesting to the historicity of these characters. And so, no, you see, there certainly was a real war, a war of succession within the Bharata dynasty. I am not fantasizing anything. You see, this is not some flight of fancy of some poet or so. No. This is just normal history. So yes, you see, the Mahabharata is based on real history.
Was in ancient Indian civilization connected with other ancient civilizations of the world, like that of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or China, etc.?
Yes.
And if yes,
of course,
how
very certainly.
How close the connection was?
Well, in some areas very close. Like there is now, in recent years, there's been a lot of archaeological work done in Oman, on the Arabian Peninsula. That was more or less a colony of Harappa.
Okay.
The material influence is very intense. But India has always been known for its jewelry, and so And jewelry, fortunately, is something easily preserved. See, I mean, for archaeologists have often a problem that, like, wooden houses, for example, they disappear over time, they get completely eroded. Now, jewelry, by contrast, is something well preserved. So we find Indian jewelry all over Central Asia, all over Mesopotamia. So the influence was quite intense, and clearly India had a great reputation. It was something where a lot of things were to be had. We know the biblical King Solomon, 1000 BC, he traded with a place on the Indian coast, which the Bible calls Opir. Apparently, it's the place Supara near Mumbai. But so it was there all the time. So India had a great influence, a great radiance, in the whole area, certainly.
Can we say that all the ancient civilizations followed similar pattern of faith and culture, or they were different?
Well, I mean, of course, all civilizations had their specific merits, which are not the same for each one of them. And so, yes, you see, typically they had a radiation. I mean, the more primitive, the less advanced people living around them used their services, oriented themselves towards it, borrowed their cultural artifacts, for example, their calendar. So that counts for all the civilizations, like almost by definition. But so in the ancient world, India was special. It was far larger than Mesopotamia or Egypt, and it was materially quite advanced. Public works in Harappa, the sewage system, for example, is unique. It won't be reproduced in any city in the world until Rome, 2,000 years later. So India was very advanced in that regard. It was very well organized, and it was also apparently, that has been noticed by many archaeologists, it was apparently a very egalitarian society.
Okay, so thank you very much for sharing your valuable knowledge and information with All India Radio Pune.
Yes, my pleasure.
Yes.
I'm really glad I've been able to communicate with your audience. Namaste.
Namaste.
प्राचीन भारतीय संस्कृतीचे आंतरराष्ट्रीय अभ्यासक डॉक्टर कोएनराड एल्स्ट यांची इंद्रजित बागल यांनी इंग्रजीतून घेतलेली मुलाखत आत्ताच आपण ऐकलीत. या मुलाखतीचा हा उत्तरार्ध होता. तर श्रोते हो, डॉक्टर कोएनराड एल्स्ट यांनी भाषाशास्त्रीय अध्ययनातून प्राचीन भारतीय संस्कृतीच्या संदर्भात केलेलं विवेचन आत्ताच आपण ऐकलं. मला खात्री आहे हे विवेचन तुम्हाला नक्की आवडलं असेल आणि त्यातून बऱ्याच गोष्टी नव्यानं उलगडल्याही असतील. आजच्या कार्यक्रमात मी निलिमा पटवर्धन आता तुमचा निरोप घेते. पुन्हा नवीन विषयासह भेटूया पुढच्या कार्यक्रमात. नमस्कार.